Okay, in this tutorial we're going to look at some things called neurons. So what is a neuron? A neuron is a type of cell, and you may have heard of it called a nerve cell. So a neuron is a type of cell, and these are special cells that carry electrical signals through our body. So this here, it's a little bit of a tweaked or a photoshopped image, but this is essentially an image of a neuron. Now we're going to look at neurons, and we're going to look at, in particular, a little bit more in a little bit more detail about what they look like and the different parts of a neuron. So when we're looking at neurons, we're really interested in what we call a part of our body called the nervous system. Now it's not a system that's nervous, but it's a system that consists of nerve cells or neurons. So let's get started. The nervous system. The central nervous system. This is really the core of who we are. The central nervous system is made up of the brain and the spinal cord. So they're protected by the skull and the spine. So all of the central nervous system is always covered by some sort of bone and protective layers. The brain covered by the skull, and the spinal cord covered by our spinal column. Alright. The central nervous system, its job is basically to process information from senses and to organize how we will respond. So this is really the part of us that thinks and processes information. It's kind of the computer, the processing center of the brain. The peripheral nervous system, so peripheral means kind of the outside. This is basically all the senses and the nerves that connect or feed into the central nervous system. So I use the analogy in my class that this is kind of like your computer, the box, the brains of your computer, and then this is all the things you plug into it. It's the mouse, it's the keyboard, so the things that can sense movement and touch. It's the webcam, the thing that can pick up light. It's the microphone, the thing that will pick up sound, and the wires that plug into the computer, so the things that carry those messages to the computer. The central nervous system is the processing center. It's enclosed in a case in the skull or in the spine, and the peripheral nervous system are all those things we plug into it to feed information to it. Cool, fantastic. Alright, central nervous system, peripheral nervous system. Okay, so what is a neuron? Neurons are specialized cells that conduct electrical impulses. And basically, guys, throughout our body, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system are made up of these neurons. Now, you may have heard of something called a nerve. So we have lots of nerves running all through our bodies, and those are basically the cables that carry messages from, in the peripheral nervous system, from the senses, from things like our nose and eyes and our skin, the things that sense touch and temperature. They carry those messages to the central nervous system, to the neurons there. So nerves are basically like a bundle, like a cable, and it's actually a bundle of a whole bunch of nerve fibers. So these you can see a nerve here, and inside the nerve it's basically a bundle, long stretched out cells, these neurons, or actually it's part of the neuron, and we'll look at that in a second. So a neuron, this is basically what a neuron looks like, and there's a few parts we're going to go through here. So a neuron, the main part of it here is just called the cell body, or the soma, and this is just the bulk of the cell. It's where we've got the nucleus, which is kind of the command center of the cell. It controls what the cell does, and this is where we get kind of the bulk, the majority of the cell. So what else do we have? Dendrites. So what are dendrites? Well, dendrites are little projections, that means bits that stick out, that connect with other neurons. So these are the bits that can connect with other neurons, and basically they can pick up signals from other neurons. So this is kind of the sensing end. They pick up messages from this end. Alright, the axon, or the nerve fiber. So the axon is a thin tube, an incredibly thin tube that conducts electrical impulses. And they can be over 1 meter long, which is just incredible, because most cells are a fraction of a millimeter. They might be 1/100th of a millimeter wide, or even 1,000th of a millimeter wide. and this cell can actually be a meter long. That's 1,000,000 times longer than some of our other cells, but it is incredibly thin. All right, and that's why it's impossible to if we break these in our body, it's impossible to rewire them when you've got a whole lot of them and they're just that tiny. So an axon is a long, thin tube that conducts electrical impulses, and it basically allows information to pass between the sensors and effectors. So sensors being things like our eyes, ears, the mechano and thermoreceptors in our skin that we spoke about, and effectors are things like muscles, things that do things, and the central nervous system. So these basically, the axons, a nerve is a bundle of axons. It's basically a cable that's made up of hundreds and hundreds of axons that carry the messages from the central nervous system, from our brain or the spinal cord, where the information is processed, out to or from basically the peripheral nervous system, all the stuff that's out there. So those nerves, the bundle of these axons, are basically part of the peripheral nervous system. The cables that connect the webcam, the microphone, the mouse, the keyboard, all those sensory input, and the speakers, the sensory output things, all right, all the things that are feeding information in or out from the brain, and their cables. All right, myelin sheath. So up here, this myelin sheath around the outside is basically an insulating layer, insulating fatty layer that prevents the electrical impulse from escaping the axon. So as the electrical impulse comes from the cell body, the soma, the dendrites pick up a signal, the cell then sends a signal, an electrical impulse down the axon here to make sure it doesn't just leak out, to make sure it gets all the way to the other end. We insulate, just like you'd insulate a wire by wrapping it in plastic. The myelin is a fatty layer that insulates it and prevents that electrical impulse from escaping. Now my understanding is I believe Stephen Hawking has a condition where basically that myelin sheath, as he's gotten older, has started to break down, and that's why he's stuck in a wheelchair, is because basically when his nerve cells fire, when they send an electrical impulse down the axon, it just doesn't reach the other end, so it can't activate the muscles to actually move. All right, so quite an awful disorder, I guess, but something we're understanding more about, and hopefully in the future something maybe we can do something about it. All right, the nodes of Ranvier. So the nodes of Ranvier are essentially just a small gap between the myelin sheath. So the myelin sheath is actually produced by other cells. They wrap this fatty layer around the axon, and there's a tiny little gap in between them, very, very small. So nodes of Ranvier are very small gaps in the myelin sheath. Now at the ends here we call the axon terminal. This is basically simply where the electrical impulse will reach the end here, and from here it gets passed on to maybe an effector like a muscle or something like that. The axon terminal is basically where the signal ends up, and the name suggests it, the terminal is the end, so it's where the impulse reaches something, its next point. Okay, so that's a neuron. We're going to look at a couple of different types of neurons though. So these different types of neurons are slightly different, and it's really important for your assessment, guys, that you essentially learn the three types of neurons and be aware that their structure is a little bit different. They all have the same parts essentially, but they're arranged a little bit differently. So a sensory neuron, this is what picks up information from our receptors. So receptors are things like chemoreceptors in our tongue and in our nose that pick up tastes and smells, or photoreceptors that pick up light in our eye and our retina, or it could be receptors in our skin, like thermo receptors or mechanoreceptors that pick up temperature and touch and pressure, all those sort of information. The receptors basically here, you've got dendrites that interact with them, pick up that information and send an electrical impulse down the axon. Now you'll notice in a sensory neuron the cell body is often somewhere along the line, somewhere in the middle. And from there it'll go into the cell body and out the other side and continue down the axon, alright, until it reaches the axon terminal. And this axon terminal is usually all the way. It's feeding. Remember, the job of the sensory neuron is to take it from the outside. It's part of the sensory neuron is part of the peripheral nervous system. It takes that signal all the way to the spine. So this would usually end up in the spine, where it passes the information on to the central nervous system. So, relay neurons or interneurons, these are basically the ones in the central nervous system. So the sensory one passes it on to the relay or the interneuron. And basically, because these are involved in processing information, it's all about connections. So they have lots of inputs. Here, the dendrites can take lots of inputs from lots of different neurons, and the axon has got lots of branches too, so lots of outputs. It can pass the information on to lots of other neurons as well. So it's all about those connections. Our brain is basically just a whole bunch of these interneurons, all connected together in a complex kind of arrangement that kind of can then be used to process that information. So the sensory neuron feeds into these interneurons. These are part of the central nervous system, so they're found either in the brain or in the spinal cord. And when the information gets to these all have a chat with each other. The electrical impulse gets passed around from one on to the next or between a whole lot of them, and they basically process how we're going to respond. So from there, we go back again to the peripheral nervous system. So these ones, the cell body here, this end would again be in the spine, but the rest of it is outside the spine. So this is the peripheral part of the peripheral nervous system. This is a motor neuron. So this is the outward signal. So again, the signal is picked up by the dendrites. So the electrical impulse always starts from the dendrites and ends up at the axon terminal. Okay, so the cell body is inside the spine and the central nervous system end, and it carries the motor neuron, part of the peripheral nervous system, carries it from the central nervous system, where we've processed that information, down the axon, all right, ending up at the axon terminal at some effector, something like a muscle, something that can actually do something to respond. Okay, so they are all slightly different, and you do just need to be aware of that. You need to be able to maybe identify, if we gave you a picture, which one of the neurons it is. So let's just put that together really quickly. So here we've got the peripheral nervous system, the part that's in the outer kind of layer, and here's the central nervous system. So like I said, this is the computer, this is the processing part that processes the information and decides, how are we going to respond? And this first part here, this is all the things that feed information in or out. So this is basically the computer. This is things like the mouse, the keyboard, speakers, microphone, webcam. All right. So most of those things, like like the mouse and the keyboard, are taking information about touch. Webcam's taking light information. A microphone's taking sound information, and the sensory neuron takes information from those things and passes it on to the central nervous system. Our motor neurons, if you've got a fan attached to your computer or something like that, or a speaker, is taking information from the processing thing here and sending it out to the effector, things like muscles or our voice box, things that are actually going to make us do something. So the central nervous system is just a whole bunch of interneurons that will process that information. So normally, say in this example, our eye might pick up some light, a light signal. That'll send signals down sensory neurons. Once it reaches an interneuron, that'll be in the spine. Messages will get passed up to the brain and passed all around the brain, and we'll think about and decide how we want to respond. And then a message will get passed back down through a motor neuron, when it'll go down the motor neuron to some effector, and maybe we'll move because we're getting too hot, or we'll start to shiver because we're getting too cold, or we'll see something we like and it'll make us, maybe it's a food and it'll make us, start to salivate, to drool. That looks good. Okay, but some sort of response. So guys, this first part here, part of the peripheral nervous system, feeds into the central nervous system, and then back out through the peripheral nervous system. And looking at the sensory neuron, well, what's different about that one? Okay, well, it's got the cell body kind of in the middle, dendrites out in the picking up signals from our senses, axon terminal in the spine. All right, interneurons basically don't have the myelin sheath. Okay, they're a lot smaller usually, lots of branches all interconnected. Okay, motor neuron, So this time the dendrites in the spine end feeding in from the central nervous system, and the axon terminal out in the effector, something like a muscle. Okay. Right, I think we'll leave it there. So this is basically how our nervous system responds to the environment. Signals get picked up by receptors. Receptors pass that signal on to a sensory neuron. That's part of the peripheral nervous system. That feeds into the central nervous system, which is a whole bunch of interneurons that process the information, and then it feeds back out through a motor neuron, which again is part of the peripheral nervous system, and that activates some sort of effector, maybe a muscle. Okay, guys, we'll leave it there, and we'll get into the next tutorial.